The desert had grown merciless, its heat pressing down like a smothering hand. Every blade of grass had curled into dust, and even the cicadas had fallen silent. Inside the weather-worn barn, two tiny infants lay nestled in a bundle of worn blankets. Their lips were cracked, their skin pale. They hadn't cried in hours, and that silence was worse than any wail. A baby's cry meant life, breath, hunger, but silence meant death was circling close. Caleb Ryder knelt beside them, his shadow falling across their fragile bodies. His calloused hands shook as he brushed damp cloths across their foreheads, the last bit of moisture he could coax from a tin cup. He whispered words of comfort, though his voice cracked, hoarse from thirst and despair. His wife's memory haunted the moment, her final breath taken in childbirth, the weight of her promise laid upon him. Asterisk, keep them alive, Caleb. They're all that's left of me. Asterisk. The ranch he had inherited was little more than a dying patch of land. Once, herds of cattle had roamed across the golden pastures, neighbors had stopped by with stories and laughter, and the well had run deep with cool, sweet water. Now, only dry earth remained. The drought had stripped the land to bone, and with it, stripped Caleb's strength. Horses lay buried behind the barn, cattle had been sold for pennies, and the townsfolk who once called him neighbor had long since fled to greener valleys. He stood alone with nothing but his horse, Midnight, and the twins whose breaths grew shallower each hour. Caleb pressed his forehead against the old barn wall and drew in a trembling breath. He knew what had to be done. Somewhere beyond the barren ridges lay an abandoned homestead. He had heard whispers at the trading post weeks ago that a spring still lingered there, hidden deep beneath cracked stone. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all he had left. He returned to the twins and kissed each of their foreheads, lingering as if each moment might be the last. "I'll be back," he murmured, though the words felt hollow against the stillness of the barn. He wrapped them tightly, placed them in the shade where a thin breeze moved through the slats, and whispered, "Hold on for me. Just a little longer." Outside, Midnight waited, a tall black stallion with flaring nostrils and restless hooves. The horse had grown lean through the drought, ribs pressing against his hide, but his eyes burned with a fierce loyalty that matched Caleb's own. Caleb saddled him with shaking hands, tightening straps as though binding his own fate. He mounted and gave one last glance at the barn door, as though imprinting the image of his children into his soul. The land stretched out before him, endless, cruel. Each mile across the cracked plains scraped away at his hope. His lips split, sweat stung his eyes, yet he urged Midnight onward. The thought of his children's silence, those lips that should have been crying but only hung still, drove him harder than hunger or thirst. Hours passed before the shape of an old homestead broke the horizon. Its timbers leaned, bleached white from sun and time. A broken windmill creaked with the wind's whisper. Caleb dismounted, his legs trembling as he pushed open the warped door. Inside, the stench of rot lingered. Dust clung thick to the air. He stepped cautiously, scanning shadows. His boot caught on a coiled rope tossed across the ground, frayed and stained. His chest tightened, signs of men not long gone. He crouched near the hearth and brushed aside ash. Fresh footprints pressed into the soot. His heart beat harder. A sudden noise.
He spun.
The blow struck before he could draw his knife. Stars burst across his vision as he crashed to the ground. Rough hands grabbed his arms, pulling them behind his back, binding him with the same ropes he had just seen. His head throbbed, the taste of iron filling his mouth. Voices murmured in the dark. He caught only fragments, talk of water, of leaving no witnesses, of a well hidden nearby. When he came to again, his wrists ached from the bite of rope. The room swayed in dim light, his vision blurred. He strained against the bindings, but the knots held. Outside, footsteps faded, laughter trailing into the night. And then the silence pressed in, heavier than the ropes, heavier than the pain. It was not the silence of the desert, but the silence of memory. He saw the barn in his mind, the tiny bodies still and pale, lips unmoving. His breath hitched, panic searing through his chest. Each moment here was another step toward their death. Caleb shut his eyes, forcing back despair. His voice came low, raw, barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of every promise he had made to his wife, to himself, to the two helpless lives depending on him. I will not let them die. The words hardened into iron within him, and with that vow, the story pressed forward into the darkness, where escape and survival lay waiting, if he had the strength to seize them. Caleb's wrists burned with every tug against the rope, skin raw and blood seeping where the fibers bit into him. He leaned forward, teeth clenched, muscles straining, but the knots only tightened. The bandits had bound him well, confident he would wither in silence inside this broken shack. He could hear them outside, their laughter carried on the night wind, their boots crunching across the dry earth. They spoke of moving at dawn, of a hidden well they would plunder and guard. Caleb's heart twisted at the thought. Water existed out here, close enough to taste, and he was chained like a dying dog while his children lay at home gasping for breath. The memory of the barn returned sharp as glass. Two tiny bodies bundled beneath the beams, lips parched, eyes too weak to open. That image struck him harder than the ropes. He had no luxury of surrender. He pressed his cheek to the ground and rolled, searching, his eyes finding a splinter of wood jutting from a rotted beam. Inch by inch, he dragged himself closer, rope scraping, breath shallow, until he pressed his bound wrists against the shard. The first slice was shallow, but it gave him hope. He saw his wife's face in the darkness, Sarah, smiling faintly, her hand resting on her rounded belly before the twins came, whispering, "They'll need you when I'm gone." The echo of her voice carried him through the pain. He ground the rope harder against the wood, sawing, skin tearing, wrists slick. The bandits' laughter grew distant, distracted by their fire. Midnight's restless neigh carried faintly across the night, as though the horse sensed his master's struggle. The rope frayed. One last twist, one desperate wrench, and it snapped. Caleb gasped, pulling his hands free, blood dripping down his arms. He staggered upright, his legs trembling, but determination stiffened his spine. He crept toward the door, pressing his back against the wall as shadows flickered from the campfire outside. The men sat in a circle, bottles in hand, rifles propped carelessly against a post. Their laughter carried into the empty night. Caleb's eyes fell on Midnight, tethered nearby. The stallion's ears flicked toward him, nostrils flaring, hooves pawing at the ground. Caleb felt the unspoken bond that had carried them through drought and hunger. He whispered under his breath, "Easy, boy. Just one more ride." One of the bandits rose, stumbling toward the horse, muttering something crude. Midnight lashed out suddenly with a violent kick, hooves cracking against the man's ribs. He fell screaming. The others jumped to their feet, chaos erupting. Caleb seized his chance. He lunged for the nearest rifle, hands slick with blood, and swung it hard against a man's temple. Another rushed him, knife flashing. Caleb grappled with him, the blade nicking his side, but with a guttural roar he shoved the man back into the firelight. Gunshots exploded, splinters flying as bullets tore through the shack's wall. Caleb dove behind a post, firing wildly, not to kill but to scatter them. Midnight reared, pulling hard at the rope until it snapped, then charged through the fray, scattering men like dry leaves. Caleb seized the chance, sprinting for the stallion. He leapt onto Midnight's back, clinging with all his strength as the horse surged forward into the night. Bullets whined past his ears, shouts fading as the darkness swallowed them whole. The desert wind lashed his face, but every mile between him and those men was a victory. His side burned where the knife had kissed him, but he pressed a hand to the wound and leaned low over Midnight's neck. He whispered through gritted teeth, "They're waiting, boy. We can't fail them." The stallion carried him across the broken earth, hooves drumming like thunder over the barren land. Caleb's chest heaved with every breath, fear and hope clashing inside him. He thought of the bandits' words, a well hidden nearby, water enough to save a life. If he could find it, if he could reach it before they returned, salvation might still be within his grasp. Hours blurred together, the desert stretching endless under the stars. Caleb's body ached, blood loss weighing him down, but he clung to the thought of his twins. Their silence was a ticking clock, each moment drawing them closer to death. He would not allow it. By dawn, he could see the faint outline of his ranch against the horizon. The barn sagged in the distance, and the sight nearly broke him. Would he arrive too late? He slowed midnight, slipping from the saddle with knees that almost buckled beneath him. He pushed open the barn door with trembling hands. Inside, the air was stifling, the smell of dust thick. He rushed to the corner where he had left them. His heart seized. The twins were still. He knelt quickly, pressing his ear to their lips. The faintest whisper of breath touched his skin. Alive but slipping. Relief and terror mingled in a single wave. Caleb pulled them close, cradling their tiny bodies against his chest. Tears stung his eyes as he whispered, "I'm here. I'm here, my loves. Hold on for me." Their silence gnawed at him, louder than any cry. He rocked them gently, whispering prayers into their hair. But he knew the truth. Without water, without hope, they would not survive the day. He laid them carefully back in their blankets and rose to his feet. His legs trembled, but his resolve solidified like iron. He could not stay here, not with death circling so near. He saddled Midnight once more, strapping cloth to shield the twins from the sun. He tucked them close to his chest, their tiny bodies bound against him, their weight light yet heavier than any burden he had ever carried. The desert yawned before him again, cruel and vast, but he no longer felt the same man who had stumbled into the abandoned homestead. The ropes, the blood, the fight, they had burned away his weakness. He was sharpened now, cut down to the bone of his purpose. He had nothing left to lose except everything that mattered. Caleb lifted his gaze to the horizon, jaw clenched, voice steady as he whispered, "We'll find it. I swear it." Midnight's ears flicked, as if he too believed. Together they stepped into the blazing sun, father, horse, and fragile lives bound by a single desperate will. Behind them, the bandits stirred, realizing their captive had slipped free. Their shouts carried faintly on the wind, vowing vengeance. But Caleb did not look back. His world lay only ahead, in the desperate search for water, in the fragile rise and fall of his children's breaths, in the vow that no desert and no man could break. The desert sprawled before Caleb like a furnace with no end, a canvas of blistering heat and endless silence. He cradled the twins against his chest, wrapped in strips of cloth to shield them from the sun. Their breaths were shallow, faint as whispers in the wind. Each time he glanced down, fear clenched tighter in his gut, for the line between life and death grew thinner with every mile. Midnight pressed on, hooves sinking into the dust, muscles rippling under his lean frame. The stallion's endurance carried them forward, yet even he was slowing under the sun's brutal weight. Caleb's throat burned. Each swallow was agony, his tongue dry and swollen. The thought of water became a torment. He could almost hear it, the cool trickle of a stream, the splash of a bucket lowered into a well, but the mirage mocked him, vanishing as soon as he blinked. His mind drifted back to Sarah, her laughter carried across memory. He remembered the night before the twins were born, when she leaned against him and whispered that they would never be alone. He had sworn then, in the quiet of that night, to protect them. That vow now weighed heavier than the sun itself. At midday, Caleb reined Midnight to a stop under the meager shade of a rock outcropping. His hands trembled as he loosened the cloths around the twins, checking their lips, their fragile faces. They were pale, their eyelids fluttering as though trapped between dreams and nothingness. He pressed his forehead against theirs, closing his eyes as silent tears cut trails through the dust on his skin. Their silence echoed louder than a scream. He whispered, "Stay with me. Please stay." The horizon rippled. At first he thought it was heat playing tricks again. But then he saw movement, dark figures cresting the ridge, slow and deliberate. The bandits. They had tracked him, unwilling to let him vanish with knowledge of the well. Caleb's heart pounded, but there was no room for fear. He strapped the twins back to his chest, swung onto Midnight, and spurred him forward. The stallion surged, dust rising in great plumes as hooves thundered across the barren land. Shouts erupted behind him, sharp commands carried by the wind. Gunshots cracked, bullets hissing past like angry wasps. Caleb bent low over Midnight's neck, the twins shielded by his arms. Each report of the rifles tore at his nerves, but the thought of his children pushed him harder. He would not fall here. He would not die before they had a chance to live. Hours passed in a blur of heat, fear, and grit. Caleb's side throbbed where the knife had cut him earlier, each jolt of the horse reopening the wound. He felt the warmth of his own blood seeping, but he gritted his teeth and pressed onward. He remembered his wife's face again, remembered her strength as she endured the agony of childbirth to bring the twins into the world. If she could face that with grace, he could face this. By dusk, Caleb guided Midnight into a dry ravine, its high walls casting long shadows. He dismounted, every muscle trembling, and laid the twins gently on a blanket of cloth. They barely stirred, but their chests rose and fell faintly. Relief, thin as it was, steadied him. He searched the ravine walls, scraping at loose stone, desperate for signs of dampness, for the faint scent of earth that held moisture. His hands bled, nails breaking against rock, but nothing came. Only dust, only silence. A rustle echoed above. He turned sharply, eyes locking onto the silhouettes at the rim. The bandits had found him. They descended like vultures, rifles gleaming in the dying light. Caleb's pulse hammered. He snatched his knife, his rifle slung across his shoulder, and stood between the men and his children. His voice broke as he called out, "You'll not take them. You'll not take a drop from me." The fight was savage. The first man lunged with a club, but Caleb drove his knife upward, steel finding flesh. The second fired, the bullet grazing Caleb's arm, spinning him sideways. He stumbled but did not fall. Midnight screamed, rearing and striking out with hooves that crushed another man to the ground. Caleb fired his rifle, the sound deafening in the ravine, dropping one of the shadows advancing. Blood ran freely from Caleb's side now, hot and wet, weakening him, but still he fought. Every strike, every shot was born of desperation. He was not a soldier, not a killer by nature, but tonight he became both. Not for glory, not for revenge, for the fragile lives behind him, too silent, too still. When the dust settled, 3 men lay still, and the rest scattered into the desert, their shouts fading with the dusk. Caleb stood swaying, chest heaving, knife slipping from his fingers. Midnight pressed his head against Caleb's shoulder, steadying him as though lending strength. Caleb staggered back to the twins and sank to his knees. He touched their foreheads, begging silently for some sign of life. Their breaths were weaker now, nearly gone. He gathered them into his arms and rose, staggering back to the saddle. Blood loss blurred his vision, turning the horizon into a smear of color. Still, he pressed on. The desert stretched endless, but he clung to the thought of that hidden well, the whisper he had overheard in the bandits' camp. It had to be real. Without it, there was nothing left. Night descended, stars sharp and cold above him. The desert grew quiet, save for the rasp of his breath and the faint, almost imperceptible sighs of the children against his chest. He prayed aloud, words spilling between clenched teeth. "Lord, guide me. Don't take them. Take me, but not them." The land rolled on, dunes rising like waves. His body begged for rest, but he forced Midnight forward. He thought he saw shapes, water glimmering, shadows of trees, but when he reached them, there was only sand. His knees buckled, his body falling from the saddle. He clutched the twins tight as he collapsed to the ground, dust rising around him. Midnight circled anxiously, neighing, nudging Caleb with his muzzle. Caleb pressed his cheek against the sand, the heat searing even in the dark. His arms tightened around the twins. He could barely hear their breaths now, faint as moth wings. Tears streaked down his face, mixing with dust, blood, and sweat. He whispered, voice trembling, hold on. Just a little longer. Please. His vision swam, the world narrowing into darkness. But somewhere in the haze, he thought he heard water, soft, trickling, beckoning. His head turned, and in the distance he saw it, the jagged silhouette of a windmill rising against the starlight, broken yet standing. Around it, the faint outline of stone, the promise of a well. His heart surged, though his body had nearly given out. With the last of his strength, Caleb dragged himself to his knees. Midnight pressed against him, urging him upright. He clung to the stallion's mane and staggered forward, each step a battle against the weight of death pressing on his shoulders. The twins lay limp against him, their warmth fragile, slipping, but still there. Sand shifted beneath his boots as he forced one foot ahead of the other, his breath a ragged rasp. The windmill loomed larger, its creak faint in the night air. Caleb fell once, then twice, but each time midnight nudged him back to his feet. His body was failing, but his will was iron. He dropped again to his knees before the well, fingers clawing at the stone rim. His vision darkened, his body trembling on the edge of collapse. He leaned over the rim, hearing nothing. The night clung to Caleb like a shroud, heavy and oppressive, but he did not allow himself to surrender to the weight of it. He sat slumped against the broken stones of the well, his twins curled against his chest, their fragile bodies wrapped in cloth. The faint dampness beneath his bloodied fingers had given him the promise of life, but his strength was nearly spent. Each breath rattled in his chest, shallow and uneven, yet he forced his eyes to remain open. He could not rest while his children still hovered at the edge of silence. Midnight paced nearby, restless and alert, ears flicking toward the distant sounds that carried across the desert. The stallion seemed to sense what Caleb could not, shadows moving, whispers traveling in the dark. The bandits had not abandoned their pursuit. They wanted what he had discovered, and they would not let him keep it. Caleb knew it was only a matter of time before they arrived. He laid his hand on the horse's neck, whispering hoarsely, "Stay ready, boy. We'll need every ounce of you before this is done." When dawn finally broke, the desert glowed with a cruel fire. Caleb's vision blurred with exhaustion, but the sight of the rising sun filled him with a fragile determination. He shifted the twins gently, pressing his lips to their foreheads. Their skin was warm, too warm, but their breath still came. Weak, yes, but steady enough to prove that life had not yet left them. "Today," he whispered, voice breaking. "Today you drink." He rose, legs shaking beneath him, and stumbled to the well. With his bare hands, he dug again, clawing at the cracks where he had felt the promise of water. His fingers bled anew, nails splitting, but he did not relent. At last, the soil softened, and a trickle of moisture gathered. He pressed his hand flat against it, trembling with relief as coolness spread across his palm. He cupped the meager drops into his hand and carried them carefully to the twins, letting the moisture touch their lips. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, one stirred, lips parting slightly, and the faintest sound broke the silence, a weak whimper, fragile but alive. The other followed with a faint sigh that rose into a breathy cry. Caleb froze, his heart stopping in his chest. That sound, those cries, were the sweetest music he had ever known. Tears blurred his vision as he pressed his forehead against theirs, whispering, "You're still with me. Thank God, you're still with me." But the moment was fleeting. A shout cut across the desert air, sharp and cruel. Caleb's head snapped up. Shapes emerged along the ridge, rifles glinting under the sun. The bandits had returned, drawn by the promise of water. Caleb's blood chilled, but the cries of his children hardened his resolve. He strapped them close to his chest once more, every movement careful, then turned to Midnight. The stallion pawed at the earth, nostrils flaring, ready for the command. Caleb took his rifle, checked the chamber, and forced his battered body to stand tall. His voice was low but steady, spoken more to himself than to the men who approached. "You'll not take this from them. You'll not take their lives." The bandits descended with jeers and curses, confident in their numbers. Caleb raised his rifle and fired the first shot. The crack shattered the silence, sending one man sprawling into the dust. Chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the air, stone chips spraying from the well as Caleb dove behind it for cover. Midnight reared, hoof striking, scattering two men who came too close. Caleb rose, fired again, and another fell. Pain seared his side where his wound had reopened, blood soaking into his shirt, but he gritted his teeth and refused to fall. He thought of Sarah, of her voice urging him forward, of her promise that he must live for them. He thought of the twins' cries, fragile but real, and each thought became fuel, each memory a weapon sharper than steel. The fight raged, dust clouding the air, the desert echoing with gunfire. Caleb moved with grim determination, no longer the weary rancher broken by drought, but a father forged in desperation. Every shot, every strike was not for himself, but for the fragile lives pressed against his chest. He became relentless, a wall that would not break. At last, the remaining bandits faltered. Their bravado cracked beneath the sight of a man who refused to yield, who fought not for gold or power, but for the only treasures that truly mattered. One spat a curse, fired a final wild shot, and then they scattered, fleeing into the endless desert. Their voices faded with the wind, leaving only silence in their wake. Caleb lowered his rifle slowly, chest heaving, the world swaying around him. Midnight pressed close, steadying him with a nudge of his head. Caleb staggered back to the well and sank to his knees, clutching the twins against him. They whimpered softly, their voices weak but growing. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. Life. They were alive. With trembling hands, he dug deeper at the well until the trickle of water grew into a thin stream. He filled a flask and let the liquid touch the twins' lips again. Their cries grew stronger, rising in pitch, the sound filling the barren desert with something it had not known for too long: hope. Caleb drank last, only enough to steady his breath, then leaned back against the stones, clutching them tightly. The sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows, but Caleb no longer felt its cruelty. He felt only the fragile weight of his children in his arms, their tiny hearts beating against his chest. Midnight grazed nearby, ears twitching, body finally at rest. The desert had not claimed them. Against all odds, they had endured. Caleb gazed out at the horizon, where the land stretched empty and endless, and he saw not despair but possibility. The ranch was broken, the well shallow, the future uncertain. But for the first time he believed it could be rebuilt. Not for himself, but for them, for the legacy Sarah had entrusted to him, for the cries that now proved her spirit lived on. He whispered into the stillness, voice soft but unshakable. We made it. We'll rise again. For her. For us. The twins' cries answered him, piercing and alive, carried on the desert wind like a hymn. Caleb closed his eyes, tears spilling freely, and let the sound root itself deep within his soul. No storm, no drought, no bandit could strip that away. As the day stretched forward, the desert seemed less cruel, less empty. The broken windmill groaned overhead, and the thin stream of water whispered a promise of more. Caleb leaned his head back against the stone and allowed himself to breathe, truly breathe, for the first time in what felt like forever. He knew hardship still lay ahead. He knew survival would demand more battles, more endurance. But he also knew this: they had won today. And as long as breath filled his lungs and his children's cries filled the air, tomorrow would be theirs to claim. The camera of fate pulled wide, framing the barren desert where a single man, his horse, and two fragile lives clung together in defiance of death itself. Against the vast emptiness, their survival burned bright, a flicker of resilience no darkness could extinguish. And though the desert stretched endless, the sound of the twins' cries rang louder still, carrying a message to any who might hear. Life endured. Hope endured.